Hey, I'm Mike.
And I'm Lisa, and I'm really excited to be spending time with you in this new series focusing on God's big promise. So Mike, what's the best promise you ever received?
Well, when I was in high school, my parents promised me that if I got into university, they would get me a car.
Oh, nice.
Which I was super pumped about. So you can imagine actually going to get the car, knowing the freedom I was going to have, driving myself around, was so excited about that.
That's great promise, and that ties into today's big idea that Jesus is God's greatest promise. So let's check out today's God story to learn more.
Could you imagine what he was feeling holding Jesus in his arms at Hi everyone, it's Jen. I'm so excited to be with you today. Have you ever had to wait a really long time for something, maybe for dinner or a trip you're gonna go on? Speaking of trips, I love to go on vacation at a certain hotel every year. But in order to get this particular hotel, I have to book it 11 months in advance. So it's really exciting when you're planning and you book it, but then I have to wait more than 300 days to go on vacation, and that seems like a pretty long time. Sometimes we wait and wait and wait for something that isn't even that great. We might have to wait at the dentist's office, at the doctor's, in the grocery store line. We just have to wait. Well, in today's God story, we're going to hear about a promise that God made to his people, and they had to wait hundreds and hundreds of years. But this promise was worth the wait. This promise was Jesus. And that leads me to today's big idea. Jesus is God's greatest promise. Today, we're going to dive into a God story just a few days after Jesus' birth. He was only a few days old. This story is about Jesus, an older man named Simeon, and an older woman named Anna. In Jerusalem, Mary and Joseph went to the temple with their baby Jesus. When they were there, well, let's just read it. There, in Jerusalem at the temple, they presented him to the Lord. In the law of the Lord, it says, "The first boy born in every family must be set apart for the Lord." This is a law that God gave to Moses in the book of Exodus. They also offered a sacrifice. They did it in keeping with the law, which says a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. Now this is a law that God gave to Moses in the book of Leviticus. So Mary and Joseph obeyed the rules that God gave to the Hebrew people, but I'm sure they didn't expect what happened next. In Jerusalem, there was a man named Simeon. He was a good and godly man. He was waiting for God's promise to Israel to come true. You see, God had been promising a rescue, a savior to his people for hundreds of years. Really, since Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, God was promising a rescuer that would save people from their sin and reconnect them with God. That story was all the way back in Genesis 3, and today's story is in Luke chapter 2. Can you imagine how much happened between those two stories? Now, that's not the only time that God promised Jesus in the Old Testament. Scattered throughout the Old Testament, God promises his people a rescuer. Prophets share of a coming savior, someone who will rescue the Israelite people, someone who will set them free. The people have been waiting for so long. And then Jesus is born. But there are only a few people who know that he is the one that God has promised. And that's where Simeon comes in. Let's read. The Spirit had told Simeon that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. The Spirit led him into the temple courtyard. Then Jesus' parents brought the child in. They came to do for him what the law required. Simeon took Jesus in his arms and praised God. He said, "Lord, you are the king over all. Now let me, your servant, go in peace. That is what you promised. My eyes have seen your salvation. You have prepared it in the sight of all nations. It is a light to be given to the Gentiles. It will be the glory of your people Israel." How cool is that? Before other people knew that Jesus was the Savior, Simeon knew. Could you imagine what he was feeling, holding Jesus in his arms as a baby and knowing? That would be an amazing experience. If that wasn't cool enough, there was another person, a prophet named Anna, who came up to them. After Anna got married, she was only married for 7 years before her husband died. When Anna's husband passed away, she spent day and night at the temple worshiping God, praying and fasting. Let's see what happens next. Anna came up to Jesus' family at that moment. She gave thanks to God, and she spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the time when Jerusalem would be set free. Joseph and Mary did everything the law of the Lord required. Then they returned to Galilee. They went to their own town of Nazareth, and the child grew and became strong. He was very wise. He was blessed by God's grace. Anna also knew something was special about Jesus. She knew that he was the one they were waiting for. She knew that he was the promised one of God. Mary and Joseph must have been overwhelmed by this. Could you imagine being the parents of God's greatest promise? As Jesus followers, we know that Jesus came to show us God's love and to save us from sin. We know what happened with Jesus as he grew up, began his ministry, and then died and rose again. We also know that Jesus is God's son. But the Israelite or Jewish people didn't have the whole story like we do today. They only had little hints and pieces of it. So for Simeon and Anna to have the clarity that Jesus was the promise that the people had been waiting for hundreds of years, this is amazing stuff. Jesus was definitely a promise worth waiting for. Jesus is God's greatest promise. Well, friends, it was so great to be with you. I will see you next time.
Now quickly turn to the person next to you and answer the following question.
Question time. If Jesus is God's greatest promise, what other things does God promise us?